Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. That's a podcast dedicated to the events leading up to the revolution, dedicated to celebrating those events. My co-host is Bob Allison. Thanks to producer Jonathan Lane for lining up today's excellent guest, and that's Chernoh Sesay, Professor Chernoh M. Sesay Jr. He's a black historian, a black Atlantic and colonial North American antebellum United States history researcher, focusing on the intersection of religion, black political thought, identity, and community formation, and author of this cool piece, The Revolutionary Black Roots of Slavery's Abolition in Massachusetts. Welcome to you, Professor Sesay. Thanks for being with us. And Bob, why don't you kick things off?
Okay, well, it's great to see you, Professor Sesay. And right now you've been working on African-American Freemasonry, which really has its roots in this period of the revolution. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that piece of the revolution.
Certainly. And first off, thank you both for having me. This is a wonderful opportunity and occasion, and I'm really excited to be here. And so to begin to answer your question, Bob, Black Freemasonry is really interesting because, first off, it's a secret society, and it's a living tradition. So you have members of formal Masonic lodges that trace their genealogy, their heritage, back to this first lodge in Boston. So that's a really big deal, and it talks not just about the historical significance of African Freemasonry in the context of the Revolutionary period, but it also highlights the relationship between the past, the present, and even the future. So there's this way in which the history that has of the past is still in some ways present in the future. And so because of that, I think the study of African American Freemasonry has taken some very interesting twists and turns. And so much of the writing of that history was done, first off even before the 60s, but some of the more scholarly work in the 60s and 70s was work that was written by African Americans, members of Masonic lodges. And I think part of their task was simply to legitimate their lodges in the eyes of white Masons. And I think that's a fairly significant task in America's broader history of race, racism, and racial relationships. And so much of that literature outlined the kind of early institutional development of African American Freemasonry, and in many ways it was kind of apologetic. And then you had scholars who found this interesting associational activity and recognized that it was important, but also thought that maybe it was a little weird because it's this secret society, it's this fraternal organization. And that's some of the earliest, more scholarly accounts, or I should say accounts of Black Freemasonry done by kind of formal scholars, were accounts that situated Black Freemasonry within this binary of these people wanting to be separate from American society or wanting to assimilate or integrate into American society. And so I think these two frames shaped some of that early work. And I think they've done a wonderful job of introducing the significance of this group and their ideas. And I think my work is trying to do a better job of situating African American Freemasonry within the events that happened at the turn of the 19th century. So looking at the Revolutionary era, but then also looking at the emergence of these more formal, separate African American institutions that begin to arise in the early 19th century.
Great, thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about Prince Hall, who's a figure who certainly looms large in this period in Boston?
Yes, Prince Hall is a major figure. He's really the reason why I became interested in this project. My dissertation advisor way back when was T.H. Breen, just a fantastic historian, wonderful mentor. And so, he and I were talking about some things. And so he asked me, how much do you know about this Prince Hall figure? A lot of people seem to mention him. He seems to be important. And yet there hasn't been any, proper treatment of him. And so, I dug around. I tried to follow some leads. There's an argument that he came from Barbados in the middle of the 18th century and arrived at Boston. I found no evidence of that, really. He only really begins to appear in the historical record in the 1770s, and when he does, I mean, he appears with all of this steam, if you will. He is helping to write these petitions that I write about. These are abolitionist petitions, and over the course of the decade of the 1770s, he is at the forefront of leading an organized group, some of them, in fact, African American Freemasons, arguing against slavery. And so I talk about these petitions. They're really important. And they speak to the degrees of organization amongst African Americans. I think they also speak to currents of abolitionist sentiment among whites and the ability of Black people and white people to work together. And so I don't say all that to say that this is just a story of this is just a celebratory story. There are many issues, right, in the broader history of the Revolutionary era, but certainly Prince Hall is really leading this effort to organize African Americans in all sorts of ways. And I think the ways in which he's trying to lead African Americans aren't just straightforward. I think they're fairly complex, and I think this is one of the things that made me really interested in him. So I tried to do research in Boston to kind of flesh out his biography. I didn't find a whole lot more than what many Masonic historians had already found. But one of the things that I did do, for example, was to say, okay, well, what's Prince Hall's network? Who is he in contact with, and how are those contacts framing responses to slavery and thinking about how to create new forms of Black community and identity? And so I spent a lot of time with Boston's tax records from 1780 to 1801. Those are really interesting, useful, and I think underused documents. And we can certainly go down into the weeds and talk about the problems of using those kinds of sources, but they were really helpful for me in trying to frame what I'm calling the social origins of African American Freemasonry. And so one of the things that you see, for example, is of all of the people that are recorded in these tax records, Prince Hall appears the most number of times. He appears like 15 times out of 20 years in these tax records. And there are no other people of color who appear that many times in these tax records. So it tells us something. It gives us an orientation about kind of the role of his leadership amongst people of color. It also begins to tell us how a white society is understanding Prince Hall's significance for them and relative to Black people. And so we see then that Prince Hall and by extension Black Freemasonry occupy this very interesting space between the way Black people are trying to create community and imagine themselves, and then on the other hand, thinking about the ways in which white people are framing revolutionary rhetoric, revolutionary ideas, and extending, or in many cases, not extending those ideas to the emancipation of Black people.
Thank you.
In order to frame what we've been talking about and make it even more useful to everyone watching, can you talk just a tiny bit about Freemasonry, like 60 seconds of Freemasonry in general, and the role of Freemasonry at the time?
Yes. So the short of Freemasonry, an associational, fraternal, communal form. So we're talking about men gathering together. It has its roots in Western Europe. There are debates about whether Freemasonry, as we know it today, begins in kind of England or Scotland, but it begins in Western Europe. And in many ways, Freemasonry is a product of the Enlightenment. So in many ways, it's an extension of much older traditions of Masonry. And these traditions get taken up in the Enlightenment, and many of the idioms, metaphors of these older traditions gets transferred, and they become ways for people to think about, construct, if you will, to use that metaphor, their worlds. And so one of the arguments about the origins of Freemasonry is that it allows this incubation for people to practice democratic ideas in these kinds of private spaces. And so within these spaces, then you have this whole element of secrecy that emerges. So on the one hand, many of the rituals of Freemasonry are closed to the public. But at the same time, Freemasonry does want to present a certain degree of publicity in establishing itself as a very kind of important associational mechanism, particularly within these, urban European environments when you're getting the explosion of all sorts of kinds of associational and kind of private activities, reading clubs, and these kinds of things. And so, Black people take up this model. Now, at the same time, there's also a bit of interesting scholarly controversy, because as much as African Americans adopt the features of Freemasonry that are coming from Western Europe, there is also conversation about the degree to which Black people change, reframe, or reimagine Freemasonry. And so, given the origins of some of Boston's community of color from West Africa, various places in West Africa, there are scholars who are interested in thinking through the degree to which, for example, various kinds of West African secret societies might have influenced the emergence of African American Freemasonry. And the evidence is really difficult to deal with, right? Because we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, and how do you begin to trace the transference, the transformation, the continuity of culture across that very kind of treacherous journey. But nonetheless, I think it's a really important question that loops back to your question about the origins of not just Freemasonry, but then in this case, African American Freemasonry.
Bob?
Now, Prince Hall, there is the story about Prince Hall creating this Masonic lodge and getting a charter. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and so the short story is that during the Boston's occupation by British forces, that Prince Hall encounters a member of what was a Masonic traveling lodge. And so, in some ways, back to the question about the origins of Freemasonry, one of the key components of Freemasonry is that you have its expansion, and its expansion is part of really the Western European colonial expansion. And so within that expansion, one of the key questions is that if one wants to organize a new lodge, the creation of that lodge, the founding of that lodge, has to be done in a legitimate fashion. So that lodge has to be recognized by other lodges. And this is where you begin to get into the weeds in terms of, grand lodges and the authority of different kinds of Masonic lodges, groups, right, to allow, to create, to initiate their own members, and in some cases to also legitimate the emergence of new lodges. And so traveling lodges were a form of essentially Masonic association that in effect traveled. So rather than having a big hall where people went to meet, you would have these ideas of lodges that could allow for people who are very mobile in the Atlantic world to gather together. And so the story goes that Prince Hall met a British soldier who might have been of Irish origin. And this soldier initiates Prince Hall and 14 other men as Freemasons. And so for very long, up until 1784, so this initial encounter happens in either, there's controversy that I don't want to take up our time with now necessarily, but that this first initiation happens either in 1775 or 1776. and or 1778, depending on how you read certain documents. We'll use 1775. And so from 1775 to 1784, Prince Hall and this group of Masons are recognized as Freemasons, but they do not have the authority to initiate new members, new Black members. And so they are under what was called a kind of a working charter. They were recognized as Masons, but they could not form a lodge that would allow them to initiate new members. In 1784, they receive an official charter from England that actually puts them on this roll of lodges that was kept by the Grand Lodge in London. And so what this roll did was allowed this larger organizing Masonic body to essentially keep track of all of these other lodges that might be popping up all over the Atlantic world. And so 1784 marks this kind of official date where they receive that charter. And they receive that charter through a network of sailors, some of them including African-American sailors who themselves were Black Freemasons, who actually travel to London and bring the physical charter back. Although I have not seen that charter, it is actually in existence. The Lodge 459 in Boston actually has that lodge still, or the charter still.
It's fascinating.
Professor, in your piece, The Revolutionary Black Roots of Slavery's Abolition in Massachusetts, you talk about how successes and failures, well, about how it's defined in terms of successes and failures, but in between the successes and failures is Black politics in general at the time. Can you talk a little bit about Black political activity at the time that we don't hear about in terms of successes or failures?
That's a fantastic question. And so just to say a little bit more about your frame, to think about Black political activity in terms of successes and failures is certainly an important question, right? When you have people organizing to critique something like their enslavement, certainly one of the outcomes that they wanted to see, that even looking back into the past that we would want to see, is the efficacy of their efforts, the degree to which they're able to organize themselves, the degree to which they're able to get other people on their side, and the degree to which they're able to really, I would say, expand their message. So those are all parts of this question of success or failure. But those are also parts of the question that you asked, Bradley, in terms of the complexities of their organization. So, for example, Prince Hall, it seems, was literate because it seems that he signed his signature to various historical archival pieces. The degree to which he's literate, we're not sure. Again, the evidence of his biography is very scattered and scarce. There are, in fact, multiple people of African descent who are called Prince Hall in historical sources. But from what we know, Prince Hall was able to write. Many of the people, or I should say the relative few who follow him, we see them signing their signatures with an X. So they aren't literate. So certainly in terms of being able to write these documents and then to have them published, we can imagine that African Americans had various strategic relationships with whites who could allow them to get their message out. So that's one aspect of this organizing piece. Another aspect of this organizing piece has to do with the degree to which and the ways in which people of African descent understand the rhetoric of the revolutionary era. And certainly this rhetoric, with its roots in the Enlightenment, and if you wanted to, you could tack it back earlier, but we'll use the Enlightenment. This rhetoric of natural rights and human equality historically is new rhetoric. It marks these historical breaks, you could argue, these new ways of thinking about what it means to be human. And there are many ways in which that rhetoric is idealistic in a sense, or maybe that's the wrong word. Maybe it's better to talk about the rhetoric of human equality and natural rights as abstract. and theoretical, even though it is making these arguments that very quickly take deep root in society and actually help generate something like the American Revolution and critiques of the British Parliament and eventually the king even. And so I think one of the ways in which Black Freemasonry and more broadly Black activism in the Revolutionary era has been described is in terms of the degree to which Black people understood and absorbed this new abstract language about what it means to be human. And so there's two things happening, I think. On the one hand, Black people are using this language of natural rights and human equality to show the hypocrisy of white colonists, British colonists, who are using that language to justify their own revolution, while continuing to maintain the enslavement of Africans. So that's a very powerful rhetorical move. But at the same time, I also do think that people of African descent and Africans, because of their very personal experiences, also recognize the pragmatic aspects of that language. And so, beginning in the second half of the 18th century, you begin to get greater numbers of African Americans who are bringing freedom suits against their owners. So they're taking their owners to court. And certainly, as much as a legal environment relies upon abstract legal theory, it also relies upon very practical give and take between those who are involved in these legal controversies. African Americans are running away from their owners. A lot of great work shows how many of these runaways, the majority of them were men more than women, and I think that's for some very interesting reasons. And so this question about responses to enslavement, when you begin to open that question up, you see that it works on many different levels. It works in terms of these abstract and theoretical ideas, but then we also have to think about the relationship of those ideas to what's happening on the ground. And as much as African Americans, and we see this in the petitions that Prince Hall helped write, as much as African Americans are invested in this new language, I also think they recognize the limits of that language. And I think that in their day-to-day behavior, in the ways that throughout the 18th century, they are resisting or running from their enslavement, I think that African Americans recognize the power of this rhetorical language, but I also think they recognize that there are all of these negotiations that happen. So I think they recognize freedom is something that can be abstracted and that can be described in universal terms, but I also think they understand freedom as something that is always conditional and always negotiated. And so I think that when you're approaching their activism, if you frame their activism in either of these two positions, I think you miss what's happening in the middle. And I think that's where the really interesting things are taking place.
Thank you. Bob?
So then they're using this same language that the Massachusetts Assembly is using, the Sons of Liberty are using about their own condition. So I'm really wondering what the response then is of the Massachusetts Assembly, these others. We expect great things from men, one of the positions says, who have taken such a stand for human liberty. So then how does the Assembly respond when they're using their own rhetoric, saying,
and
well,
this
what about
certainly
us?
raises the question of the limits of Black activism. So there are no direct responses to the use of Black people of this rhetoric. We see the petitions that are first written in 1773 and then extend up over the course of 4 years in 1777. We see the tone, the language of those petitions becoming much less deferential and far more impatient. Now, you're only talking about a span of 4 years, and it's a span of 4 years that exists on kind of the beginnings and then the in the midst of the actual war. And so on the one hand, the direct response to that question, Bob, is that the responses are very limited. But at the same time, when we begin to open up that question, there's recent work, for example, that shows how beginning in the mid 18th century, the number of whites who are beginning to manumit, free or release their enslaved people, that number is beginning to grow over the course of the latter half of the 18th century. And so this is recent work, and it suggests that something is happening on the ground that where you have reactions against enslavement, particularly in New England, that are arising, and the sources aren't just discursive or rhetorical, but that rhetoric and discourse are in concert with other things. I think more work needs to be done to kind of flesh this out. But I say this to say that I think the relationships between Black and white people are framing the activism of Black people. And so to your question about the petitions themselves, I think they reflect, in some ways, one aspect of this larger abolitionist project that's happening on the part of Black people in Massachusetts, for example. So I think the petitions force a kind of public conversation. They force the revealing of the hypocrisy of white colonists who are using this rhetoric of freedom but continuing to enslave other people. It is certainly the case that when you begin to dig around in probate records and other records, even though tax records take off Black people as taxable forms of property by 1784, you still can find examples where people are being enslaved in Boston and in Massachusetts. So I think those petitions do serve a very important purpose of highlighting these issues. I think they also serve a purpose of publicizing the leadership of a certain group of Black people. But at the same time, the response to those petitions in particular, on the one hand, I think it's building on things that are happening before. And on the other hand, I think the responses themselves on the parts of whites are hesitant, and they are frustratingly slow for people of African descent.
Thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, in the Revolution, there were about 9,000 Black soldiers, which made up about 4% of the soldiers involved, and about 5,000 of those were active combat troops. My question is, what would motivate them to fight?
And that's a great question. What would motivate an African American to fight on the side of the Patriots?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the answer is certainly freedom. But when we begin to open up this question of freedom, then we begin to see how that can be defined in any number of ways. So, an easy answer to that question is that Black people are deeply invested in this language of human equality and natural rights. They've internalized that, and they think it's worth fighting for. And you could argue, I think, also that Black people, if they've already established themselves in their communities in America, they might have an investment in being American that existed before the emergence of this new rhetoric, right? So in other words, the desire to fight for something or to live in a particular place can be animated by these ideas. It can also be animated by the idea that you've had multiple generations who've lived there and you've established a kind of community there that's worth fighting for. That argument is in some ways far less glamorous, if you will, in terms of highlighting this revolutionary rhetoric. But I think it speaks to the relationship between ideas and lived experience that we always have to be attuned to in answering these questions.
Thank you.
So one figure who lives on to us in memory is Phyllis Wheatley, whose book of poetry is published in 1773, the same year as these petitions. So that 250th anniversary of that is coming up. Could you talk a little bit about Phyllis Wheatley's relationship with Prince Hall and this community we've been discussing?
Yeah, that's a great question that I'm still doing work on now. So Phyllis Wheatley marries John Peters. John Peters and she marries him in, gosh, is it 1778? Oh, forgive me, I'm blanking on the exact.
That sounds close enough.
Marriage. It's before 1780. So she marries John Peters. John Peters is an interesting fellow. Again, we don't know a lot about him, but he does appear off and on in Boston tax records up until 1780, at which point he is described as being dead. He spends time after Phyllis Wheatley's death in 1784. He spends time in debtor's prison. He had various financial relationships with whites in Boston. So even though he winds up in debtor's prison, relatively speaking, he's one of the more well-off of Boston's African community. And he spends most of his time living in what we would kind of think of today as Boston's North End, the northern side of the city, wards 1 and 2, if you go back to the late 18th century. And that in and of itself is interesting. And this gets back to the question of Wheatley, because beginning in roughly 1797, 1798, you begin to get the emergence of a Black neighborhood on the west side of Boston. And so Peters and Wheatley, there are not documents that demonstrate that they created habitable residency in that neighborhood. And so the geography of Boston, even though it's not that big of a city, raises these interesting questions about community. So Phyllis Wheatley never lives kind of in this Beacon Hill area. Yet Boston is a relatively small city. At one point, she has this unpublished manuscript. Peters, there are records, and this Vincent Coretta in his biography of Phyllis Wheatley talks about this. There's this manuscript apparently that Peters is trying to gain, is trying to acquire, and the reason I bring up that manuscript is because it's very interesting. The Freemasons in Massachusetts, the Black Freemasons, they must have known about somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, but there are no documents where they talk about Phyllis Wheatley. She was a huge figure, right, in these broader debates about African American intelligence and about abolition, but there are very few there are no documents really linking her in a kind of discursive fashion to African American Freemasons. This is something that I'm still working on, but as of yet, I've not found anything there. And so another interesting thing is that when you move forward in time, even though Phyllis Wheatley is mentioned in, for example, the African American press of the 19th century, there's somebody else. And here, even though we're moving beyond the Revolutionary era, this deserves mention. David Walker was in fact a Freemason. This is something that, again, people have mentioned, but nobody has spent a lot of time thinking through. And so today we think about, in terms of the emergence of a Black public sphere coming after this Revolutionary era, we tend to think about David Walker and his radicalism, but we don't think about him relative to African American Freemasonry. And so to think about how somebody like him, this male figure, becomes this very prominent voice in the emergence of Black public spheres, and somebody like Phyllis Wheatley, I think, despite her significance early on, I think her public voice, at least early in the 19th century, does not speak as loudly as that of David Walker. And so I think there's some very interesting things going on in terms of masculinity and gender and the framing of these Black public spheres. And I think African American Freemasons play kind of an outsized role in their significance on the emergence of these Black public cultures. And at this point, this is a bit of conjecture, but I think masculinity, its dominance, has something to do with the way in which Phyllis Wheatley's legacy is understood immediately after the Revolution.
Professor, thank you so much. Unless you have something else, Bob, we're pretty much out of time.
No, this is great. It's been great talking to you, Chernoh. So
this has been lovely.
We'll have to leave him wanting more. You're such a great guest. We'll have to have you back if you will come back.
Oh, certainly. And I want to thank both of you for, just allowing me to speak on behalf of, in fact, these historically underrepresented voices. This has been great.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.
So let me get to work getting this distributed out on the many arms of social media. Thank you very much. This is the Revolution 250 podcast. Thank you to co-host Bob Allison, and huge thanks to Jonathan Lane, our producer, for getting wonderful guests like Professor Sesay. Thank you and goodbye, all.